Welcome to the Translation Summer School webinar. This is our second online event, and today we'll speak about localization, as you know. It's a very interesting and highly technical topic, I should say. In fact, we decided to go deeper into the subject on request of our last year summer school students who were very much curious and interested of various aspects of localization. So they asked us to expand on it. Besides, if you are a student and if you want to know more about localization as well as about other aspects of translation profession, you still have a chance to be a student of Translation Summer School 2020. It is totally free, and you only need to write a test translation and a short essay. Then you can be selected as a summer school student. You can learn more about it from our website, and you can see in the chat the address of our website. So today we invited an expert in teaching localization, Professor Dr. Uta Zeewald-Haag. She's been teaching software localization and the different aspects of technical translation for years. And we are sure that even those who are localization industry professionals will learn something new today. So please write your questions to Dr. Uta Zeewald-Haag in the chat box, and she will answer them during the second part of the webinar. Now I welcome my colleague, Lesya Ivashkevich, who will introduce our today's speaker. Lesya, you're welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to see you all here, and I'm very glad to introduce you our today's guest, Dr. Professor Uta Zeewald-Haag. She is an expert in localization and translation technology. She is the Vice Dean of the Department of Applied Sciences and Linguistics at Anhalt University in Germany. She teaches localization technologies, terminology management, machine translation, and other courses. And she also organizes a spring translation school in Curtin each year, in which I was lucky to participate several times. Uta is a person who combines love both to languages and language technologies. She is one of the founders of an amazing interactive museum of German language in Curtin, which I visited several times. And for me, it's a place which is the best example of how can you show how fascinating the language is. And for me, it's always a pleasure to listen to Uta Zeewald-Haag. And today I have a great pleasure to share this evening with you. And I welcome you, dear Uta, and give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Lesya. Thank you very much, Alexander. I'm very happy that you invited me and that I may share some of my experience in software localization. Hello and good evening, everybody. I'm very happy to be with you this evening at the Translation Summer School, organized by those very exciting people like Lesya and Alexander. So I first want to give you an introduction on the main topics of software localization. And this I will do with the help of some slides. And afterwards, I would like to give you a demo with one of the most common localization tools that are used in the localization industry. So as Lesya already mentioned, I'm a professor at Anhalt University of Applied Sciences, which is in Germany. And there I'm responsible for a master's program in software localization. Therefore, I have the pleasure to share the knowledge of localization, which a lot of students, as well with students at the University of Strasbourg, because they have an online master in software localization. And I'm very happy to share my knowledge tonight with you and to tell you what software localization is. Some were already very close to what I will talk tonight. So software localization has or deals with the adaptation of software products to the language, culture, and preferences of consumer markets. And I would like to start to give some more detail about what localization is. So if you think of the world market, you know that there are very many languages that are spoken, and one has to have in mind that among those who do online, who purchase things online, 92.2% prefer to shop and make purchases on sites that price in their local currency. You may have that experience perhaps done yourself. And another interesting fact is that among those, 33% are likely even to abandon a purchase if pricing is in US dollars only. And this means that products need to be linguistically, culturally, and technically adapted. They need to be what we call localized. And localization here is a requirement to use products worldwide without barriers. So I try to give a definition what software localization means, the different aspects of software localization. So what we already mentioned is it's the adaptation of a software product to a local market. First of all, with its linguistic features. And if you have a look, for instance, at this menu bar, here you see that the English menu bar is shorter than the German one. And this reminds us already that in localization, the space that is available on the screen is very important, and that programmers had to have in mind that other languages than English may use more space than English. German, for instance, or Russian, perhaps Ukrainian as well, French, and so on. They need at about 30% more of the space in text fields compared to English, for instance. So the adaptation with its linguistic features, but as well with its cultural features. I remember that the first mailing programs showed up with an American letterbox, for instance, to indicate, oh, you've received a new email. At that time, so 25 years ago, people in Europe, neither in Western nor in Eastern Europe, I think, knew this symbol because they weren't used to American letterboxes. Letterboxes in our areas often look like that, and therefore in other updates of email products, this then disappeared, and nowadays it's shown or symbolized with an envelope. So cultural features play an important role, and we only can adapt software products with its linguistic and cultural features with special technological methods and tools, because otherwise we don't have access to UI, to user interface elements that have to be adapted. In the area of software localization, one big market is the localization of video games, and another one of websites of very different companies. So let's summarize. Software localization refers to the adaptation of a product, an application or document content to meet the language, the cultural and other requirements of a specific target market. And this is called, in computer science at least, and finally also in our domain, a locale. And this is the basic stem for the word and concept of localization. So if we think of localization, you heard now, and perhaps you already knew that this has to do with language, but besides language, you have as well to do with culture and with technology. And in the next minutes, I will focus on the technological aspect of software localization. So here, for instance, if you see what can or has to be localized, we have so many different software applications, but at least some of them have in common that they have menus to control an application. In very different applications that can be purchased, you have buttons with labels that have to be translated. You find instructive text that tell you to insert a flash drive, for instance. But you have as well descriptive text, very common as in video games, but as well in other applications. In video games, you find very many literary texts because there the story has to be told, besides all these technical things. And because there are so many different applications of very specialized domains, medical, automotive, and so on, language for special purposes is as well something that has to be translated in the area of software localization. If one looks at an IT product, it has so many different branches. So the product itself is often presented on a web page. The software product itself contains the software with its user interface, but as well with a documentation, a box in which it is delivered. And there are a number of legal things that have to be considered as well, license agreements, packaging, advertising material. So there is not just the software, which, however, is the core element of software localization. And if we now look at a graphical representation that has been published by Microsoft a number of years ago, you see here the process of creating localized software, which is very close to the development. And that means that this involves a great deal of communication between localizers and developers. Because sometimes, at least in cases where developers didn't think about a localization of their product, they didn't know what things localizers need and how user interface elements should be separated from the rest of a computer application. When a product has been developed, it is handed to the localizer, and afterwards the localized or pre-localized version then is handed back to the developer. It is tested, and the testing of the localized software may show a number of issues that on the one hand are communicated to the localizer, but they may as well be communicated to the developer, because from the point of view of the localizer, there are things coded that a localizer can't change or modify. If we talk about localization, we always have a certain universe in mind. So some key concepts that play an important role together with localization. The first one is globalization, that is represented here at the founding element or of this pyramid. And globalization means the marketing of a business on different regional markets. where one has to consider different technical, economical, and legal aspects. And you have to think of the fact that even a localized product that is offered on a certain market, if nobody knows of the product, nobody will purchase it. So globalization, so the marketing strategy, which has to have in mind the localized product and the target client, is very important as well. For the localization process, something is very important, which is called internationalization. Internationalization has been made sure by the software developers. Internationalization in the context of localization means that programs are developed in a way which allows that new country versions require no software reprogramming. And this would cost a lot of money if for each version, for a Ukrainian, a Spanish, or German version, the developer would have to reprogram a new version of the program that has to be localized. So this is very important in the context of localization. You already see here some abbreviations, acronyms that are used in the field of localization. They are represented by their first and their last letter, and in between is the number of letters that occur. And G11N stands for globalization, whereas I18N means internationalization. It's very interesting that at least in the early years of localization, even some companies used the acronym or numeronym, because if you imagine the one just like a single line, then you have lion. Therefore, companies used lion as part of their company name or product names. But internationalization and globalization are not the only concepts that occur in the field of localization. You see here the 5 different puppets, and the first of them is the globalization puppet, then internationalization and localization, but we have here a 4th one, which is called T9N, and perhaps you already imagine what this could mean. It is translation, because translation is a very important part of the localization process. At about 48 to 50% of a localization project has to be spent on translation. And something that occurred in the industry rather recently is T11N, which means transcreation. That is very interesting, because this is something that often is done without these technical devices and cut tools we have to need in the rest of the localization process, because transcreation needs a very creative approach to create new marketing strategies or things like that. I will have a closer look with you at the internationalization aspect of the localization process. Both internationalization and localization are, if you want, an integrated process. And we have to bear in mind that if a product, or when a product is developed, internationalization has to be done once. So this is something the developer has to think of. The localization aspect occurs as often as you prepare a new linguistic version. And when during this localization process, you recognize that development aspects have to be changed. This is a very costful thing, and therefore it is something we have as localizers, at least, to communicate to developers that the more attention is paid to internationalization, the less complicated and expensive the process of localization is. I would like to give you some examples of localization issues that might occur, or things that a developer has to have in mind when he or she prepares the product. So we have date formats like you see here, and if you see the different formats here, the French and the American date format just differ in the order of the day and the month. And imagine you subscribe a contract with an American client as a French vendor, for instance, and you want him to pay the money at a certain date. It is a difference to do this in December or in May. So things like that have to be adapted during the localization process. Graphics as well have to be adapted. So often they are used as icons on a software user interface, and then strings and icons shall build a unity where the graphical element helps you to use the software in a very familiar or easy way. And therefore it is necessary and important that the icon and the linguistic element fit well together. What in the example of home, which is an element of browsers, if this is translated in German by Anfang, which means beginning, then the small home, the house, doesn't really have a semantic relation to the icon here. Another aspect that has to be considered during the internationalization process, because it affects directly the localization, is the adjustment of field length. So on the left-hand side, you see a picture taken from Windows XP, and this is the German version where the user could adjust the velocity of the mouse movement. But unfortunately, the sentence just starts, and wenn Sie eine langsame verwenden Sie eine langsame Einstellung, wenn der Ordner sich. The verb is missing, so that the user wouldn't know what to do. So he could just try and see what happens. But in other situations, this could be difficult. I recently modified or updated the profile of one of the web meeting software products, and I uploaded a photo, and you see here that the label of this button as well as the label of the other button here, they are truncated so that you have to know what is written there. Otherwise you would not know that this is speichern, which is save, and the other one is abbrechen, which is cancel. So little space on user interfaces may be a problem, and one thing one shouldn't do is to abbreviate strings, because abbreviations are not common if they are not standardized. And instead of this, it would be easier or more convenient to reduce the portion of text. For instance, instead of saying inventory in order, just to call it on order if it is if we talk about a certain inventory, or that the inventory is available, it would be sufficient so that inventory could be omitted. And this then allows us to translate, for instance, available by verfügbar in German, so that we can use the space in a way that a user who didn't know how I abbreviated these things knows what he or she has to do when he looks at the user interface. Another thing that has to do as well with limited space are overlapping text elements. So one has to think of the required amount of text, and this has to be adapted to the available space, or it has to be reduced. And if this happens during the localization process, it has to be detected during the testing of a localization product. Another thing of testing, which is very important as well, is that here, for instance, you see a German dialog field that makes or refers to a button, which here is here comes from the operating system, which in my case was a German operating system. And if I now have this English dialog field, I do not know whether I really translated well, because I don't have or I can't check whether Finnish really has been translated by fertigstellen. So one should do the test as well on an operating system of the same language as the localized software product. So now I would like to talk of some aspects of the graphical user interface. So far I talked about general aspects of localization. Now I want to give you some insights in that part that has to be localized, so the UI elements. And if we look at a software product, we first have to distinguish the program code on the one hand and the interactive or interaction elements which appear on the screen. So these are the user interface elements that have to be localized. And in a well-internationalized product, these interaction elements are stored in a separate file. We will come back to this a little later. First, I will mention some of the typical components that are part of a graphical user interface, at least if this is developed with Microsoft Visual Studio. There are many other development environments that have similar resources. So we have menus like the one you see here. Some of them are followed by 3 dots, and this has a meaning on a software user interface. It means that such a menu item leads to a dialog box, and we have to know this when we translate such a menu item, because the 3 dots have to be maintained. We have dialog boxes with options that can be set on tabs and checkboxes here, and we have string tables with messages and something like these accelerator keys here. And the accelerator keys, they affect directly the way your program works. So if we look, for instance, at this menu here, you see an English menu with certain menu items, and you see another menu with translated German menu items. So Save has been translated by speichern in German. And you see here that there is something that has been related to this menu item, which is a key combination, Control plus S. German keyboards don't have the control key. They have the key, but it is labeled with STRG, which means Steuerung. So this is something that linguistically has been or has to be adapted. But something else has to be taken into account, that is the accelerator key. So often, or in many cases, it is desirable that this is the first letter of a menu item, like speichern, which starts with an S. So it's Steuerung plus S, Control plus S. If we have other menu items that start with the same letter, the initial one, like suchen here or senden, so then we have to look for another accelerator key, because these accelerator keys must be unambiguous and unique in a software product. Another aspect of a product that has to be localized, and where the prior aspect of internationalization is very important, is the fact if UI elements have not been internationalized, they are what we call hard-coded. In these cases, a localization software product that normally extract the software elements can't access these UI elements. Therefore, a localizer has to get in contact with the developer and explain to him that first, UI elements have to be extracted. They normally are referenced by an ID element and then stored in a separate file, like the one you see here. And such a separate file can easily be translated and substituted by another language. This English one, for instance, can be substituted or added by a French one, for instance. So this kind of internationalization is one of the most important ones. If we think about the aspect of translating UI elements, then it is helpful to know how these textual strings appear in the background or in the program. You see here, for instance, new, open, and when you look at this resource file, for instance, you see that this is open, but open doesn't appear just at the string as the string OPEN followed by the 3 dots. It's preceded by the ampersand sign, because in the program, and you might see this here, the O is underlined, and that means if I press the alternative button, I have the possibility to access the menu items not just by mouse movements, but as well by key shortcuts. So these are things that we have to know, as well the tabulator, which makes sure that the elements that show me the key combinations are nicely arranged one under the other. So these are things one should know when we do the translation of UI elements. In recent applications, menu ribbons are developed with an XML technology, but here as well you have to translate all these elements that appear here as strings. One of the most difficult translations might be contained in string tables. String tables are collections of strings that occur at different moments during the program. And if you have something like this one here, 117, %s to %s, it's such a small string, but this small string might be rather difficult if you think of the translation process. How is this to, or should this to be translated? There are several possibilities depending on what to means here. And this is only, or can be known if you have access to context information. But in the case of strings, string elements, context seldomly can be given. So sometimes potential errors, translation errors that are done here are only detected during the testing phase. You see here such an example with 4 different variables, and yes, one doesn't know exactly, is the first variable a number or an application like 4 files or Excel files, for instance? Have they been saved on a certain date, at a certain time, or by a computer with a certain ID, and the last one here by a user? This seems to be something that could be the value of these variables, but we only see this at runtime of the program. And what is more, in a number of languages, the order of the variables may be different than the order that shows up here in the English sentence. So now I will come to the process of localization. So the first thing that has to be done by the developer, the computer scientist, is the internationalization. Then when the product is handed to a localizer, a localization service provider, for instance, there the files that he received have to be extracted, then they are translated. Finally, the translated files have to be merged with the rest of the program so that they afterwards can be inserted in the rest of the program to create a build, a certain version of the program that finally can be tested. And I will show this with the help of a certain translation tool. But before I do so, I would like to mention a number of tools that are often used in the field of localization. So the characteristics or features, properties of such localization tools, of software localization tools, they all should have something that we call a pseudo-localization function. This is very important and valuable because with such a function we can check whether a product is sufficiently internationalized. A product like a localization tool should make use of repetition inside the software. Imagine you have a software product and you have very many buttons, and let's say we have 30 times a cancel button. You start to translate the first cancel button, and then it would be a nice thing not to have to translate them 29 times again, but to use something what is called auto-propagation, so that they are reproduced automatically in the localization environment. The incorporation of terminology is something very important because products have to be consistent, not only the user interface, but the user interface together with the documentation. And something that is very interesting, and what I will briefly show you, is that together with some applications, we might have a graphical preview of how the localized product looks like after my localization. The adjustment of text fields is something that is very helpful, and of course quality assurance functions that in an ideal world, if you have a localization tool, are really adapted to those issues that might occur in software products. Here on this slide, you see a diagram which shows that an original file that is inserted in a localization environment first extracts the user interface elements. These are then localized by the help of glossaries, translation memories, perhaps as well machine translation and terminology programs. And after everything has been localized, the localized files have to be generated so that they have the same format as the original one, so that they can be merged with the skeleton, so the rest of a file that is not used for the localization process. Something what I highlighted here is called a parser, and a parser is that component of a localization tool which is of really importance, because this component allows the extraction of the UI elements. In some cases, I have a preview of what I localize, but in other situations, it might occur that I have an original file that I localize in my cut tool or localization environment, and the target file that I produce then has to be handed to the developer, who finally has to compile this target file together with other resources of the program in the development environment, so that only afterwards, on the side of the client, the developer, one sees whether everything has been correctly adapted during the localization process. There are a number of localization tools in the industry. I just want to mention the most common tools in the language industry, and I distinguished two types of tools. So on the left-hand side, I called the CAT tools localization tools. And on the right-hand side, I mentioned translation memory environments. But some of the translation memory environments have localization functions, so that certain file types can as well be localized in a translation memory environment. Others need a specialized localization environment, and among these products we have Alchemy Catalyst, Passolo from SDL, Multilyzer, or Sisulizer. When somebody is looking for a suitable localization tool, he or she should look at the file formats that in most cases have to be processed and localized. So this is the first precondition that should be tested. Then something that is important as well is the origin and the development environment of the files, the software product that has to be localized. And finally, we have to see if parsers are available for a certain type of files that we want to localize. So this in brief shows the different key concepts of localization, and I sketched the different steps of a localization process. I now want to make a demo to show you how such a localization could look like. I here already announced my demo, but before I leave this slide, I want to give you some useful readings. So there is perhaps the only book, the only localization Bible is a book that has already been published in 2000 by Bert Esselink, A Practical Guide to Localization. And there is a very interesting and useful journal, which is the journal Multilingual. So even if you do not purchase Multilingual, you have access to some of the special editions, core focuses, and getting started guides that are available on their website. And there are several websites that give as well interesting information about how localization is done. Okay, I didn't look at the chat so far. I do not know. Are there questions so far?
Not so many questions so far,
Okay.
but I'm sure the audience will get quiet. I think they're not sure about this so much information they have to absorb.
Yes, it's a lot. I know. Yes, if the topic is for those people who didn't were in touch with localization, it's something that is really a lot. So I stop the sharing because I now want to open the program, the localization program that I want to show you. It's SDL Pasolo, which I will show you in a moment. And I will share this screen now. So I put this away. I hope you can now see these files here and my Pasolo background. So I would like to show you two different applications and the way they are or can be localized. The first of them is a small demo program, an executable file. Such a file can be launched directly, like you see here. And this application, which is called Scribble, allows us to draw lines. And we can adjust the line thickness, that it's lines that are a little more visible on the screen. So this is in brief what this application does. And if I now press the alternative button, you see perhaps here the different menu items are without an underlined letter. If I now press the alternative button, you see that the first letters are underlined so that then I can press the F button so that the menu opens. I mention this because when we localize this product, of course, we have in the background not only file as the string, but as well the ampersand sign I mentioned that precedes these menu items as linguistic strings. So this is the first thing I want to look at with you. So I close this first. I have the Scribble file in this folder here, and I now go, to my Pasolo environment. So compared to translation memory environments, specialized localization environments are a bit more or less or without a certain decor. So the usability is more the one programmers are used to. So this is the screen with which we start when we set up a localization project. So this is SDL Pasolo, and here you see a new. I will set up a new project. And the project I will create, I will call Translation School. So this is up to us to call this like we like it. And I want now to add as a source file the executable file, the scribble file here we just saw. So when I insert the scribble file in my localization environment of SDL Pasolo, then a number of things happen. First of all, you see here that on this small dialog, there is the indication of a parser. So the localization tool identified without my help that Scribble is an application in Windows 32 technology. So I do not have to do a lot more than to confirm, okay, this is correct. You see here, when you click on this small triangle, that there are a number of different other parsers. In some cases, we have to select them individually, but in other cases, they are detected automatically. So text files may be so of such a variety that parsers don't know what type of text files, of what type of text file we want to localize. But in this case, it's a Windows 32-bit application. Here even was detected that the language that has to be extracted is English. In many other cases where in the program code nobody inserted the indication of the language, we have to fill this field ourselves and have to say, okay, the language of the text is English here. One thing that is possible here, you see the options button, is that we can decide that we do not only want to extract the text elements of the application, but as well, for instance, bitmaps. I will click on this bitmap icon so that we can see the effect of that. I now confirm everything by clicking on the OK button, and I will add a target language because German is the language I speak best. I will select German. We could take Ukrainian, Russian, everything that is provided here in the long list of potential target languages. So once I indicated the file, the target, the source and the target language, and once I made sure that the correct parser has been selected by the program, I can click on OK and see the next screen where I see the source and the target file. For the target file, there is just a copy and it says that its size is 0. The reason for this is that so far the textual elements haven't been extracted. I will do this by clicking on the Create Update String List. And after having done so meanwhile I have this message that I afterwards have to open it and to decide whether tokens might not be translated so that I can prepare them and put them in read-only mode for the translator. And I should have a look at the menu accelerator table. So I click on OK here, and you see now the size has grown. Here, the original, the source language application has 149 segments. This is the indication of the size. and the interesting fact is that the target copy of the application only has 136 segments. This is because of the following thing. I open the original, the source file. So you see here how an executable file looks like when I open it in such a localization environment. You see here numbers, so they are counted, and you see something what is called the ID information, that it's the identifier that makes sure once I localize the application, the UI element is put at the correct position in the application. And if you see here in this environment, I also could click on show resource so that I have an idea of what is displayed here in my localization editor. So I see here that file, which shows up with the ampersand here, looks like that in the target environment. So with the underlined F as an access key, and then the rest of the string. And you see here as well lines where there is no text. They have the ID 0. And these are separators. For instance, you see here, when I click on 0, the line between open and print setup is highlighted. Perhaps you can see this. And there is no textual information that has to be adapted. Nevertheless, it's part of the user interface, so it appears here, as well as other separators. So because of empty elements that do not need localization, the number of elements in the target file is smaller than the one in the original one. And we, as an experienced localizer, we then look through all these elements to make sure that there is nothing that could there is nothing that could raise questions on the side of the translator. So perhaps you could mute your microphone. Some of you have their microphones switched on. So here, if we look, thank you. If we look at the strings here, once again, we see, okay, this is a menu I will have to translate. And if I now know that file, I can do this down here in the translation area or directly in this string list. If I know that file is translated by Datei in German, I insert this and enter. I can directly see the result of my translation. This is a very helpful feature of localization tools that offer a graphical preview. But unfortunately, very limited file formats only allow us to have insights in the graphical appearance of UI elements as they appear in the application. An interesting thing is as well the dialog boxes. So if we look at the pen width, so this is the dialog in which I can adjust the width of the pen from a thin to a thick pen. If so, it's not the place where I insert the width, but here I I decide how to translate them. So normally I would leave OK, so I can validate the string as a translated string. Cancel in German would be translated by abbrechen, of course with a C. And I see directly whether my translation fits into the button and the space that has been provided by the programmer. If now, for instance, default, which could be and normally is translated by Standard in German, I would call this Standardeinstellung. So a default setting, Standardeinstellung. I just use this translation because I produce a long string, and with this string you see here that I would have a problem on my user interface, because here my translation is truncated. So in such a case, either I'm allowed, or either the programmer provided me with the possibility to resize the fields, and I'm allowed to do so, then I can adjust the field size so that the entire string fits into this text field. But as you can see here, this would have other consequences. Normally you wouldn't just resize one button, even if those have the correct size for the label here, they would be adjusted to the same size so that this looks better on the user interface. But then if I do so, you see that these two fields here are very close to the other fields, so that I have to move them more to the left-hand side. So in cases where I'm allowed to do and where there is sufficient space, this kind of functionality of a localization tool is very helpful to translate such an application. In many cases, we have pre-translated strings that either are strings or terminology that is given by the client. So in cases of localization tools, we can directly insert those translations if they have the format of a so-called glossary. Glossaries are just elements, I show you this one here, that bear the translation in different table columns. So the first column here is the American English one. Here the column E is the one with the German translations, and you can add as many translations as are necessary. And normally a let's say a computer company like Apple, Microsoft, SAP, or others, they want that that the product line is homogeneous and consistent, so that to save something is called speichern, for instance, in all of the products, and not once speichern and in the other case sichern. And therefore they prescribe these terms so that we have to use such glossaries. So if we have such a glossary, we can use a glossary and do a pre-translation. So the pre-translation here shows us the possibilities, what we can use when we translate. So of course we want to use a certain glossary if we have got one. In this case, the glossary is called MFC Glow. This is something that is already included or delivered with Passolo. It's the Microsoft Foundation class glossary. We might have project glossaries or the current project with different files from which we can take the translation, or the translation list with which we work actually. So then we have to indicate settings, because in some cases we might be interested to allow as well automatic translation. Then we have to specify a certain limit, so of similarity, to which things have to be taken from the glossary, and afterwards, if the string doesn't fit exactly to what is listed in the glossary, then a machine translation program intervenes. So I now want to translate this. So if we have access to resources that like machine translation or translation memories or servers, this might take a while. In my case, I have here the glossary, which is on our Anhalt University server, so it just takes a few seconds. And I go back to this list view here, and you see when I scroll through my segments that some of them have been already translated, because the strings either were identical in the glossary or they were similar. So here, for instance, file was taken from my first translation. So we had a kind of auto-propagation or a redundancy. Schließen has been translated because it's in the glossary, and others are similar. View, anzeigen, so it's an 80% match. If I now have translated everything, and of course I checked everything, the correctness, saw that as far as I can see, nothing overlapped and the text fields were sufficient, I can generate the target file. I will do so here. And after having done so, I can have will have a look at the translated file. So in general, we specify how the translated file looks like and where it is saved. In this case, I just selected the option that a suffix is put to the name of the localized file. So this is Scribble DOI. And if I now open Scribble, you see that Datei, bearbeiten, these have been translated. Pen not so far, but anzeigen, Fenster. And if I open my pen width dialog, we see other translations I just entered in my translation environment. So this is one example of how a localization process works. And here we see the advantages of a graphical preview. I already mentioned that in many cases we have text files and we do not know how the application looks like from which the files that we have to localize come from. And such an example is something I used in my XML class. So I have here something which is called breakfast menu. This is an XML file. I first will open it in the Internet Explorer, because the Internet Explorer allows us a certain preview. So you see here, and we will see this in a minute, this is an XML file which shows us a number of different dishes, Belgian waffles, or the price of the dish, and a short description together with the indication of the calories. So we now got the task to localize this food list for a restaurant, for instance. And if you if we look at the file itself, it's this one here. I will open this in a text editor. Notepad is a very helpful one. Oh, it's opened here. I have to move it. So we see here the XML file. So this is how an XML file looks like if we open it in a text editor. XML files are similar to, in certain aspects, or under certain aspects at least, like HTML files. So they have elements, so-called tags, that indicate what kind of content is contained in the file. So the name here is Belgium waffle. The price is a price that shows up in dollars, and we have a description too of our famous Belgium waffles, and so on. One characteristics of such an XML file is that well-formed XML files do have one single element, one tag that is like a bracket or a parenthesis that opens the document and that closes it at the end. I mention this because when we now take this breakfast menu XML file, I will go back here to our project. I open the project settings. I will save what we did so far. And I now will insert a second file, which is the breakfast menu file, this one here. So as soon as I insert it, the properties list appears. We saw this for a couple of minutes with the executable file. Because of the structure of an XML file, I closed it here at this. An XML file has a so-called prologue, which tells a system, I'm an XML file. This is indicated here. This allows a parser of a localization environment to select the correct parser here. Therefore, the XML parser has been selected. You may read this, add in XML parser. What you see else is that contrary to what we saw with the executable file, here the language to extract is indicated by unknown. So we have to look what the program offers us as options. So if there is no indication inside the program, it's either neutral or all languages. So everything that is a linguistic instrument or a linguistic information. But for the localization environment where I want to use terminology, glossaries, spell checkers, and so on, I have to indicate that even if there is no indication pre-selected here, I have to say this is English, or this is Ukrainian, this is Spanish. So I indicate here English, United States. Then, however, I can't finish and close here. XML files are there are so many XML files because they may come from a content management system, such a small demo as I showed you. So we have to say or to indicate to the program which elements of an XML document have to be extracted so that we can localize them. And that means that we have to create a new unknown parser rule. So you see here we have XML parsers, and now I click on the blue plus to create a new parser rule. I will call this breakfast, and I indicate that this is an XML file. This is just to find it more easily when I want to look for it at a later moment. So here you see use for XML files with this root element. And this is what I told you. Each parser for XML files needs the indication of the root element. And in the case of our food list, this is the breakfast menu element, because it's the first one which opens and which closes the document. So I copy this from here and can directly insert it at this. No, I didn't copy it correctly. Once again, kopieren. Now it should work. Yes, it does. Then there is something very helpful in this environment of Passolo, and as well in a Catalyst localization environment. We have the possibility to load the file so that we can see, oh, where are the different segments that have to be localized. I already entered here the file, and I now will open the configuration pane. So, and something which is rather easy as well for people who are not used to programming languages or even HTML or XML, you see here the different elements that occur in the XML file. And the XML elements, what we need here is, first of all, the name. So I want to translate the name so that in German it's not Belgian waffles, but Belgische Waffeln. And as the price is indicated in dollars, and I want to use this list for my German list, I would like to extract the indication of the price as well. And third of all, I want to extract the definition to be able to extract and to translate the definition as well. So if once I check these boxes here, you see that they are highlighted in my preview pane. And this is something that makes my work rather easy. I then can confirm everything and click on OK, so that now I can save my rule, my breakfast XML rule, and save and confirm by OK. And then I have to make sure by clicking on the options button that the correct rule has been selected. I may have already translated or prepared hundreds of other XML files with other root elements. Therefore, here I need the breakfast or the one I indicated here. Where is it? Didn't I do? Obviously, I didn't really do my correct selection, and I didn't save my breakfast menu. I will go back. No, unfortunately, I didn't save it correctly. So you see it once again. You can perhaps remember breakfast XML. This is what I write down here. And what I did then, I configured it. I selected the description, the name, and the price. This is what I confirmed. And then I have to save everything. I hope that my rule is saved, and I click on OK. Oh, I now forgot the element, the first element here, the breakfast element, what I copied from my other file previously. So I insert this here. I save it once again. And I hope that the system really saved it. Oh, yes, here it is, my breakfast rule. So I now select the breakfast rule. I confirm everything by clicking on OK. Once again, OK here. And I have the same thing that we saw with our executable file. The first thing we have to do here as well, we have to extract the elements. So we go to the menu bar and I click on Create Update List. And once we have a parser, so we defined a parser rule by opening the XML file and indicating which elements shall be extracted, then the localization environment knows how the XML file is structured and is able to extract the different elements. So here, for instance, you see Belgium waveforms, and I could start now to translate Belgian waveforms here, Belgische Waffeln. I just go to another one. I enter this here. So as I know that Lesja is a specialist in regular expressions, you see here a number of price indications that are made in dollars. So in such an environment where you have a number of similar elements, here, for instance, we could directly, let's say the numbers, the figures would be the same, but if we want to transfer this in euros, so it would be rather, it would take time, all the time, to delete the dollar sign and to go at the end of the line and to insert the euro. This could be something that in a nice way could be replaced by a regular expression. So let's just take the strawberry Belgian waffles. So Belgische Erdbeerwaffeln, so that I can show you Belgische Erdbeerwaffeln. Perhaps this is enough to see what happens when we now generate the target file. So we have just one price indication and two meals that have been translated by me so far. If I now generate the target file, I do the same as I did before. The translation list, the breakfast menu will be translated. And here as well, I create a file that is suffixed by the language suffix. Deu is Deutsch for German. And if I now open, so you see here that I have an XSL file, a style sheet file that makes sure that the XML file appears in a certain way on the screen. So in this localized XML file, nothing should have touched in the prologue, for instance, or the root element, but you see I have here Belgische Waffeln, then my euro price, and Belgische Erdbeerwaffeln. And if I use this file and open it in my Internet Explorer, I see the effect of what I did as well immediately. When I made my adaptation of or changement of dollars into euros, I didn't think of adapting the dot, which in European languages, most of the case, and in German especially, has to be a comma here. So that that has to be done in such a way. So you see, to come back and to close, in such an environment, if I go and will show the resources, here I do not see like this is represented in my Explorer environment. I only see here the XML environment, the XML code that I now have to translate. But even with such a file with text elements, you easily go through the elements if you have such a localization environment, so you can use glossaries, see the effects of your localized files, and so on. So just to close and to come back, I want to show you, and perhaps I do this just here on this screen because otherwise I would have to change the screen sharing. So what I wanted to show you besides these technical aspects is that much of what has to be done in localization projects is talking to other people. As a localizer, we often have to talk to the developers, to the clients. And even if we just talk to colleagues in a localization project, they may work remotely or far away from yourself, like we are several hundreds of kilometers away from each other. And if they work in different time zones, this might be a challenge to come together and to discuss things. Another thing that is, that we share as well this evening is, in general, in these huge projects, people speak English, but not English as their mother tongue, but as their second or even third language. And that means we all speak with a certain accent, and this may complicate the conversation. People may have different goals and viewpoints if they come from different time zones. But despite all these differences, or these are a core element, because understanding between people is a very important thing in localization projects. And what I tried to underline is that in many cases, we as localizers have to ask questions to the developers so that we don't make mistakes, or we show that things do not work as programmers might have imagined when they thought of localizing our or their program. And here I come to the end of what I wanted to show you tonight. I thank you very much for your attention. And yes, I would be happy if I could answer some of your questions. I wrote here, but in very small letters, the Anhalt University link. So if you are interested in software localization, or I would be happy if I had raised your interest in this topic. So be free to have a look on the Anhalt University site at the Masters of Software Localization. However, this, so far at least, is a German course, so you should speak some German to orient yourself on the page. And as Lesja already mentioned at the beginning of the talk, we normally organize in March of each year a spring school in localization and translation technology. Feel free to have a look at our university site. If you are interested in this topic, you are very welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Uta Zewaltek, for such an insightful talk. Indeed, I'm sure that even those who are localization professionals learn something new. I learned something new, by the way.
Oh, great.
First of all, about this lion as the core part of localization company names. I never knew this is the reason.
Okay, very good, yes.
Yeah, still, somewhere at the middle of the talk, we were a bit afraid that we will be left without breakfast and the menu, but then you experience food. Yes, everything will be nice. Okay.
So it's lunchtime, so I should have chosen a lunch menu, but nevertheless.
Yes, we will try to pick up the most interesting question, and the one that I liked is from, okay, I will probably not rush through the questions, but the idea is that one of the listeners presupposed that can we compare a translator also to a designer? Since actually you have to deal not only with the text that you translate, but also design the shape of the boxes, text boxes, and so on and so forth. So I very much like the idea to compare the translator with the designer. And another question to economize the time is, there were several questions very similar, that if we can use machine translation in localization, to what extent and how much? So these are questions to start.
Okay, thank you. So we'll start with the aspect of a designer. So in a certain sense, we can compare the localizer to a designer. But if we think of programs like the Scribble program, or think of Word or Microsoft Office programs, as well as medical programs that are often just in small devices, we don't have the possibility to be very creative with respect to the shape of labels or of buttons. This in these cases is in general created or developed by the programmer. So our creative part or designing part is the one that we have to make sure that the target product is a product that is or with a usability for the target user. We often speak of the look and feel of a product, so that it looks like a product that has been created or developed for me as a client of a German, a Ukrainian, or another market. So I shouldn't see at first glance, oh, this is a translation coming from English or Japanese or something else. So the creative part with respect to translation is perhaps a huger one if we look at video games. But there as well, the localizers work in an intense relation with the vendors or the programmers of the video games, because the characters, they have been created before. But if I see as a localizer that, for instance, a character has some features that won't be understood or are even not allowed on a target market, then it's up to me at least to tell the designer, so this has to be modified in a certain way. It's not, in general, it's not me to redraw something or yes, to modify this, but I have to communicate this. So the designing aspect only is restricted to the resizing of labels on the one hand and of the creative linguistic aspect. This was perhaps, I hope that I answered this question or referred to this aspect. Machine translation, yes, machine translation is sometimes used in software localization, but one has to make sure whether the concrete application really is one that that allows machine translation. I showed the menu options. So let's take File or New, and then you have Control+N. So in this, these strings, Control+N, for instance, have to have a certain syntax as well in the program, and often machine translation tools, if they are not trained for these specific types of strings, they insert white spaces between Control plus and the access key, so that this might cause an enormous work afterwards. So one should should pay attention to or which part of a program really allows machine translation. If you have very long descriptive text parts or instructive text parts, machine translation can even help you as well in the case of a localization project like the ones I showed you. Perhaps not in these brief elements of menus, but where other text portions are used on the screen, there it can be helpful. It should be tested before, so it may create an amount of work if I didn't check this before I really used it in a certain project. I saw a question here in the chat. Vlad asked, is it possible to use this program for working on freelance platforms? I'm not really sure what is meant by freelance platforms. So
I asked Vlad, he meant just globally using it for freelance project. So
okay. Yes, if this is the question, yes, it is. So Pasolo here runs on my individual computer. There is a server component with which I can communicate, but I do not need any server devices, so I can install it on my individual computer, so that this best fits as well for freelance translators. If I work in a translation group, then of course it should be, one should have access to common files, and this as well is able with Pasolo, but it depends on the edition one purchases. But here what I used is, let's say, a freelance version, in the sense that it's not dependent on other components on other devices. Somebody, sorry?
I wanted to read and maybe to add also for from myself. We have many teachers here, and they're interested, how do you teach localization? Because in Ukraine we don't have such courses at universities, and it's interesting whether your students work with real materials and how big the courses are, and maybe how did you start to develop this course? Because it's something very exclusive, I think.
Yes, you're right. So the situation is the following. I'm a computational linguist and I worked on, let's say, traditional linguistic aspects for a long time. And then I became part of a computer science department, and I saw the enormous advantage to combine the computer science aspect with the linguistic aspects, and to teach localization in a field where computer scientists learn their work for their for their profession. So I started was inspired by the environment. And in our courses, our localization courses, especially those where we do exercises, in general are small groups where 15 to 20 students sit together. We have computer labs where everybody has a computer which is equipped with a localization product, and the exercises are part of a lecture. So we have 60 hours, a 60 hours lecture of localization of graphical user interfaces, and at least half of it is dedicated to exercises so that students learn to work with these tools and how to define parser components, how to extract things, how to look at the quality of the translation and so on. And yes, and the first, or it depends, the type of files I use depend on what we about to learn. So there are companies around which from time to time ask our department to show them how localization works, because they discovered that their product could be an interesting localized product for other markets. Sometimes I'm allowed to take these files or examples for our localization classes as well. In other cases, I look for free computer games or sample files that have the same structure as files of huge programs. But this is an important thing, to do things that are similar to what we see in the industry. And what you already saw, Lesia, so we produced small films, for instance, with subtitles, and of course we used this as well to make some localization exercises. So if there are industry partners, I'm very happy if I can use their material, but in many cases I use as well things that I construct after official products, so that we can see how parser rules have to be defined.
Do you have some special computational linguistic courses, or do you just explain some separate concepts like parser or string to your students during the classes?
Yes, we have a bachelor's program and a master's program, and they do not have typical computational linguistics classes that are that focus on let's say parser rules or something like that, or linguistic extraction or of on certain grammars for natural language processing. We use, or in my classes, I insert these topics and I show these parts that are needed by localizers, so that they know, or yes, they have the necessary insight for their work. So it's really, it's translation on the one hand, a bit of computation from the computer science department, fundamentals of computer science, and then these localization aspects.
Okay, we are lack of time, but still I will try to use my opportunity to ask questions, and will ask a question on my own. It's about the future of localization. In localization, the industry to which I also belong as a head of a translation company, they are pretty much frightened on the one hand by the imposure or of the machines. And secondly, so they are afraid of losing their jobs.
Yes.
So how do you, as a scholar, maybe with a somber mind, see the future of localization? Maybe the nearest future, at least.
Okay. Yes, I see different branches, let's say. The translation industry, in which we translate documentation, technical documentation, for instance, this is something where already nowadays, in very many cases, machine translation is used. So for this type of documents that have to be translated, machine translation really will, yes, change the paradigm of a translator or of translation. Here, translators will be needed as post-editors in many situations. So their way of working of a translated text is not just to produce the translation, but to see that the quality is as the client asked for it. But there are different aspects where the human translator still plays an important role. These are all the things where computer applications with space restrictions and limitations come into play. This is something where I, from a translation point of view, can put a certain text, but a machine translation system, so far at least, doesn't look for translations of a restricted string size, for instance. So this is something just the human translator is able to decide, as well as these access key components. And if you think of creative translations, so far at least, I can't imagine a video game translated by a machine. So the one who wants to play the game wants to be attracted by the game, and it shall be from a linguistic point of view with variants. And a computer program doesn't produce variants, so it's more or less a consistent way of translating. And this is very helpful in certain domains, like technical documentation, but in other domains like marketing or the already mentioned video games, their translator are needed. So therefore, I just mentioned the small puppet, the transcreative one. So this, of course, is something where translators who like their linguistic variants and so on, they will find a good field in the transcreation area. And the specialized localization field, as I showed it here, I think this will be a field where machine translation plays already a role, but this role is restricted to certain texts occurring in such applications.
Thank you. I would also like to ask the question, because we have a lot of students, and we have a question. What are the requirements to enter your master's degree? Is the Ukrainian bachelor diploma enough for that, and what are the main requirements?
Yes, the requirement to enter our master's degree is to hold a bachelor's degree. And so there are several different bachelor degrees, not only over Europe and the world, but as well in Germany. Some have 6 semesters. That means 3 years, others 3.5 years. And we even allow these different bachelor students to enter in the master's degree. Those who only have a 6 semesters bachelor have to learn in a 4 semesters in a 2 years program, whereas those who already have a 7 semesters bachelor or something which corresponds to 210 credit points in this European transfer system, then they only or are they have access to the 3 semester, to the 1.5 year program. So a Ukrainian bachelor should completely be yes, one of the certificates that are usable as an entrance to the program. Another thing is that, as I already mentioned, so far it's a German program. There are some classes like international marketing, localization of graphical user interfaces that are taught in English, but very many other classes so far are taught in German. So you should have a certain knowledge of German to be able to follow those classes and to understand the content.
Thank you a lot, dear Uta, for such an interesting presentation. I think we all learned a lot today. And thank you all for coming today. And we will be thankful if you spread the word about the forthcoming translation school in June.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. So it was really insightful talk. And we also thank the audience. Thank you for being so patient. It was almost 2 hours, and it's longer than we expected.
Yes.
Thank you very much, and see you. Yes.
Thank you very much as well from my side as well for having invited me. It was a pleasure for me to be part of the translation school. I hope you all the best, and I hope I will see some of you in other environments and at other circumstances. Thank you very much. Bye-bye and good evening.
Bye.